So thanks, Roma, for the kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here. I know some of you have come from rather far, so I'm quite grateful for that. Of course, I'd like to thank Professor Milani. For the Persian part of the crowd, you know, this is a bit like Hosseini Ershad, you know, but the content will be different. Yeah, Tekiye perhaps. Yeah. Okay, so Professor Milani has been kind enough to extend this invitation, and I believe the idea came about the discussion perhaps you had with Mr. Golestan, Ibrahim Golestan in the UK, and Mr. Fani, if I recall correctly. So anyway, I'm quite grateful for the fact that these gentlemen met and had their sort of discussion, and this idea came about, and I'm able to be here. Of course, I'd also like to thank the Iranian Studies group here at Stanford. Roma has been most kind. Franco, I'm sure there are other people, Wahid, okay, many others who are really putting these events together. So thank you so much for all of your efforts. I'd like to make a special mention. We have members of the Erani family with us here tonight, actually. Taghi Erani, who's really at the center of our discussion tonight, as we shall see. He had 3 sisters. He was never married, he doesn't have offspring, but he had 3 sisters, 2 of whom had children, and some of whom are here with us tonight. Okay, so I'm most grateful for the fact that kind of made the effort. I'm quite moved by that, actually, and so they're here amongst us. And there's an extended family, so they're all here in attendance, and I'm quite privileged that you made the effort to be here. So thank you very much. Yeah. All right. I don't really want to necessarily talk about the book per se, because the book follows the life story of a polymath, a kind of a Renaissance man. He did many things, and he lived during a very, very, very tumultuous period in contemporary history. This is the interwar period. So when World War I has ended, and everyone is kind of relieved, it was a big catastrophe. It was largely a rivalry between Great Britain and Germany challenging the sort of the supremacy of Great Britain, but then that kind of rivalry dragged many other countries into it, okay? And it spread beyond Europe, well into the Middle East, where Iran is, of course. And of course, there was a secondary theme, which was that the Ottoman Empire was collapsing after some 600 years, and it was just a question of who's going to pick up the pieces. So that was quite a tense period in history. So that's essentially 1920s and 1930s. Yeah. And so this individual that we'll talk a little bit more about, okay, he did many things, and of course he was quite, essentially like a very sensitive instrument, was registering all of these different things happening, these tectonic shifts, okay. And as a consequence, his life took a very dramatic turn from what was purely science and fundamental science, gradually into things that were more on the soft side of things, the humanities, political philosophy, political thought, political activism. So it just kind of, there was a metamorphosis, if you like, in his life. Yeah? So because the book is about him and his biography, I had no choice but to follow him wherever he went. And so as a consequence, it's almost impossible to talk about the book as such, except in these general terms. So what I like to do instead is stick to the title that I proposed to Professor Milani, which is one aspect of the book, or one aspect of his life or his personality, okay, which is related to political philosophy, okay. And there are other aspects related to sort of epistemology, philosophy, psychology, etc. That I will not go into those. Okay, but if there's questions and things, I'll be very happy to discuss them. Yeah. All right. So the title of the talk is "Colliding Conceptions of Modern." Yes, sure. I'm sorry. Yes.
There's at least 15 people out.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Come on in.
Yes. All right. So the title of the talk, is that okay? Yeah, okay. It's colliding. I'll just look more that way because you'll hear me. Okay, so I'm not ignoring you. Okay, colliding conceptions of modernization in Iran. Okay, it's an Reza Shah and Taghi Erani. So that's the full title that I proposed to Professor Milani. It's a mouthful. It's a complex subject because modernization is a very complex subject. It's something that touches the lives of people, you know, their personal security, integrity, opportunities, all of those things, yeah. So national modernization. Reza Shah is a complex character, okay. He's a controversial character, okay. There are a range of historians who've written about him in different lights. Taghi Erani is the most complex character, so you have a title that combines all of those complex things. It can only be an uber complex thing, okay. So, and there's a key word in there, colliding, okay. And you know, here you at Stanford, I know you have this super collider, okay. So I kind of wanted to hint that the topic can be as complicated as elementary particle physics, okay. So anyway, so to kind of deconstruct the topic, make it more digestible and amenable to discussion and dialogue, that's all we're here to do, just stimulate thought and afterwards Q&A. Yeah? I thought we can divide the talk into two parts. Yeah? Part one is really history for the sake of history. Okay, so we're just gonna kind of act like history buffs, okay, and take ourselves back to the 1920s and 1930s, okay, and try to get a feel for what was going on at that time, and specifically focusing on the personality, this person, this character by the name of Taghi Erani. Okay, so we're just trying to kind of get a sense of what was he thinking, what was going on in his mind, how was he digesting and, you know, sort of processing all these different really political, geopolitical, cultural, social, ideological, all these currents and trends that were ongoing, okay? So he's really our protagonist. We're zooming on him, yeah? But the story also has an antagonist, okay? The literary people call it the villain, okay, sort of the bad guy of the story, okay, and that villain is Reza Shah in this story, okay, and we cannot not say anything about him because he figures in a big way in this story, okay. This is not about Reza Shah in a global sense. This is about how his story intersects with the story of Taghi Erani, okay. And so I thought the easiest way I can do this is to just simply read to you, not excerpts from the book, but just two short pieces that are prepared. One is focusing on Taghi Erani, and we're really trying to get a sense of his mental universe, okay. And another one focusing on Reza Shah to the extent that is related to the Erani story, okay. So that's how I propose to deal with this first part, which is just history for the sake. We're just trying to understand what was going on back then. We have no utilitarian motives as much as we can help it. I know it's impossible, but as much as we can help it, you know, we're just really trying to kind of get a sense of what was going on at that time. So the approach, because I'm not from, you know, the humanities actually, my field is geoscience, okay. So I feel like I need to explain a little bit my methodology, okay. So the approach that I'm using for this kind of look back at history is what I would call it Adlerian, okay. So Alfred Adler, the psychoanalyst, okay. And what I mean by that is that, if you like, I go to geoscience and then I'll come back to this and maybe perhaps it'll be clear. In geoscience and in science generally, we talk about the inverse problem. Okay, that means you have a black box, you have some things that are going in it, some things that are coming out of it, and from these you're trying to get some sense of what's in the box. Okay, that's the name of the game. Okay, what is its structure, its composition, its constitution, its characteristics, and so on. Okay, so that's in science in general. Yeah. Now here we're dealing with history. Yeah, and we're dealing with specific personalities. And so it's kind of a similar approach, really, because if we do our homework, we should know what was their environment, what was happening, what was transpiring, what was brewing, what were the events, right? So, and then how were they reacting to these events and developments? Okay, so from knowing that, these two things, we should be able to get some sense of what was their mindset, their mentality, kind of get a key to their mentality, a key to their personality, okay? And from there, everything else just kind of explains itself. Okay, so that's what I mean by Adlerian. Okay, I'm really trying to get into their minds and see what were they thinking. Okay, and there is some conjecture and guesswork, but that is my ultimate purpose. Yeah. So that's part one. So it'll be just two pieces that I will read. Okay. Now, part two is not history for the sake of history. Okay, now we have to kind of shift gear. Part two is mostly history for the sake of understanding what is it that the present is pregnant with, What is it that could evolve? What is the trajectory? What are the sort of the things that can emerge, if you like, in view of history? So we have some sense of history, not just short-term history, longer-term history. We're trying to get some sense of what is it that the future could have in store for us. Okay, so this is directly, to really do that, we have to really look very closely at this theme of modernization. Okay, by which I mean national modernization. In other words, how a nation tries to kind of keep up with the times and kind of ensure its security, ensure its longevity, ensure its sustainability, and kind of, catch up with the others who are ahead of it, because when there's a gap, there tends to be kind of an unequal relationship that develops, right? Or at least close the gap, So that's really the theme here. So it's modernization, national modernization, okay? So the second part, what I thought I could do is I could just state it to you as three observations, okay? And I would like to share that with you right now up front, okay, because I'm not sure whether we run out of time. Okay, I want to make sure that you have the gist of what I have kind of developed, if you like, mentally, intellectually. And I call them observations, but for you, they're probably simply claims, okay? Because, I can say something that's an observation, but, it still needs to stand the test of, rigor, academic rigor and scholarship, right? Proven or disproven, or partially proven, partially disproven, okay? So, so the three claims, or the three observations, if you like, are the following, The first one is that we as Iranians, okay, as a culture, as a country, as a nation, should have been thinking about modernization for at least 400 years, possibly 500 years. Okay, but it only occurred to us about 200 years ago. Okay, so we have this kind of 200 or 300 year period. We're kind of living in, we're oblivious to what's happening in the world. We're living in blissful ignorance, if you like. The world is passing us by, especially Europe. Europe is marching forward, and we're just kind of marching backward, and the gap is widening in a double sense. Okay. Of course, if it's any consolation, we were not the only ones to be doing that. Okay, the entirety of Asia was doing that. India was doing that. China was doing that. That whole geographical expanse was doing that. And that's an important sort of observation, or important sort of recognition, that since the cause for the decline and the descent, transcends our borders, then obviously we should not have a tunnel vision and focus just on ourselves. We should be looking beyond. Look at what is it that was true about this large geographical expanse that could explain in a causal sense the reason for the decline. Okay, so that's my first observation or claim. I will not say anything more about it. Okay, I think it's rather factual, and I think people generally accept it. There might be questions as to why this datum of 400 or 500 years ago. Why is it that all of a sudden 200 years ago we realized that things were not the way that we had thought they were? Okay, but I'll leave that for Q&A. Okay, if there's time, if there's interest. Yeah, I just want to give you the gist of my claim. Okay, the second claim. I expect the second claim to be more controversial, okay? Just judging from the kind of the paradigm in Iranian historiography and the discussions and so on. So nevertheless, it's my claim. So as they say in science, you're guilty until proven innocent, okay? So the onus of proof shall be on me if this is to be taken any further, all right? But the second claim says that, okay, so we were falling behind and we didn't know it, okay? Then all of a sudden something happened and we realized that we're falling behind. Okay, so now we go from sort of phase 1 to phase 2. So phase 2, last 200 years, we're falling behind and we know it. We definitely know it. Everybody knows it. Okay. However, we still have found no way of kind of rescuing ourselves from this predicament. So that's my second claim. Okay, so why do I say it might be controversial? Because specifically what it means is that over this 200-year period, if you look at the Iranian history, we've had at least 3 major attempts to deal with this problem of modernization, closing the gap, somehow trying to catch up, somehow trying to, at least close the gap with others, yeah? So we've had about 100 years that corresponds to the Qajar dynasty, in fact, more than 100 years. We've had about 60 years corresponding to the Pahlavi dynasty, okay? And we've had, so far at least, 40 years corresponding to the post-Pahlavi, or the Islamic Republic, okay? So during those 3 periods, and these are totally very different dynasties, regime systems, ideologies, approaches, attitudes, almost diametrically opposite, you may argue, okay? But all of them failed. That's my claim. All of them failed. Okay. Now when I say failed, I mean a failed compared to what other nations were able to do in exactly the same time period under largely similar circumstances. Okay, so this is relative. We have to always give context, right? So during Qajar, okay, especially late Qajar, we have the example of Japan, okay, where I lived a number of years, okay, and we had the Meiji movement in Japan, okay. So this was the movement that took Japan out of its kind of medieval morass or quagmire, and they caught up. In some sense, they surpassed. Okay. During Pahlavi, okay, we have the example of the so-called East Asian tiger economies. Okay, most notably South Korea, to which Iran is often compared, actually. All right, and during post-Pahlavi or Islamic Republic, we have notably the example of China. Okay. So these countries achieved far, 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 far more than we did in terms of development of infrastructure, acquisition of knowledge in science and technology, economic activity, wealth generation, poverty eradication, etc., etc. It doesn't mean that they don't have problems. They have problems, they have serious problems. Today is the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square, so they have problems, okay, and those things haven't gone away. But they achieved far more than we did. Far, far more than we did. Okay, we achieved far less than they did. So in that relative sense, we failed. Now, if you're partial to any of these 3 attempts, be it Qajar or Pahlavi or Islamic Republic, you could very well argue that, hey, look, there are countries that did far worse. Okay? And that's absolutely true. Right? But you never get ahead in life by comparing yourself to the worst students. So that's the essence of my thought there. Okay, so in fact, if you were to kind of really try to be as objective as possible, is my personal view, I think the strongest case is to be made by Qajar, oddly enough. Why? Because if we accept that Asia was a lost cause, forget about Asia. In Europe, there are major countries that disappeared from the map at exactly the same time period as Qajar was in existence, which is late 1700 to early 1900. Okay, I'm referring to Poland. Poland disappeared from the map. Poland, that period of Polish history corresponds exactly to Qajar dynasty. And what happened? Half of it was gobbled up by Russia, and the other half was gobbled up by the German-speaking hegemons, right? Austria in the south and Prussia to the north. Prussia later becoming the core of the German Empire and later modern Germany. So we have all these illustrious characters, these Polish personalities that you're all fond of, I'm sure. We have Friedrich Chopin, composes his music. We have Madame Curie, who does, fundamental science, far better than her husband. Okay. We have Rosa Luxemburg, doing political philosophy. They're all Polish, okay. So very prominent Polish personalities, intellectuals. But there's no Poland. Doesn't exist, okay. So, of course, they do what they do. They do it in Germany. They do it in France. They're in different places. They're the diaspora, Polish diaspora, if you like. Okay. During Pahlavi, you could very well say, hey, look, it was the Cold War, the Soviet Union, 15 republics. Okay. What does that mean? That means 1 plus 14. Okay. That means Russia holding others to bondage or some kind of coercion, okay, all these other republics, okay. And it could very well have been 1 plus 15, 1 plus 16, 1 plus 17. It could have very well have incorporated parts of Iran. In fact, 2 provinces came very close to that, Azerbaijan and Kurdistan, okay. So that catastrophe, if you like, was averted, okay. So you'd be quite justified in saying that, right? Likewise, post-Pahlavi, they could say, hey, look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq, look at Syria, look at Libya, okay? I don't want to get into the political discussions of what role they may have in some of these conflicts. And they'll be absolutely right. All of these are rational responses. But as I said, that's when we're really trying to kind of compare ourselves to the worst examples. But if we hold ourselves to the highest standards, we definitely did not succeed. Okay, if failure is too strong a word, we did not succeed. Okay, now, within the second claim, you can make a counter argument that, look, the situation was totally different for us. It was similar time period, but the circumstances were totally different. Hence, the difference in results, right? And that takes me to my third claim, which basically says that when you overstress the uniqueness of your circumstances and kind of underestimate or understate the commonality of your situation with others, you're really just kind of saying something to make yourself feel good, okay? So in a sense, you kind of fall into this trap of what I call exceptionalism, and we're just totally different, But really, we are a lot more similar to those countries that succeeded than we would like to admit. Okay, so that's the gist of my third claim, which says that, okay, phase 1, we were falling behind, we didn't know. Phase 2, we're falling behind still, but we know it, but we still just don't know how to solve our problems. And so during 200 years, and so many different attempts, different styles, different strategies, Qajar and Pahlavi and Islamic Republic could not be any more different than each other. So there must be some more fundamental reason why we have failed or why we're not getting it. Okay, so my third claim follows from my second claim. Okay, and that fundamental reason, in my view, is that we suffer in a cultural sense from kind of a cognitive disorder. Okay, and we can discuss why we have this cognitive disorder, the reasons. I mean, this goes probably into the realm of social psychology or cultural psychology, or Volker psychology, as the Germans call it. Okay. Nevertheless, we have this kind of tendency to sort of resort to exceptionalism, that we're just totally, fundamentally, in every sense different and unique. Yeah. And actually, the person who kind of put his finger on this cognitive disorder is Taghi Erani. Hence the importance of Taghi Erani. So he put his finger on the root cause of why we fail to get it. Because we're just looking at it the wrong way. All right? And in a sense, our mindset is such that it's just kind of, it's a bit like the trees that are preventing us from seeing the forest, And so that's kind of the gist of my third claim. Now, to perhaps maybe I can mention, one example of exceptionalism, of course, has two varieties. It has a kind of a positive variety. We're exceptionally better than others. Okay, so our national poet, Ferdowsi, encapsulates that essence very well, right? That art or culture is amongst the Persians and no others. Okay, so that is exceptionalism in a positivistic sense. Now, I'm not saying that he meant it or not, or what the context was. I'm just focusing on that expression. Okay, but more often than not, this exceptionalist mindset manifests itself in a negative sense, that we're doomed, we're damned, we're depraved, it's hopeless. Okay. And that is the more common manifestation nowadays for obvious reasons. Okay. So to substantiate this third claim, what I will do is I've prepared the third piece, the final piece, which tries to kind of amplify what do we mean by this exceptionalist mindset, the exceptionalist dogma, and what can result if we're able to kind of extricate ourselves from it. If we kind of take an anti-exceptionalist, stress the universality of our position as opposed to the exceptionality, of our position. What is it that can result? Okay, what kind of a blueprint or concept emerges such that we're able to find kind of which way is north, because that's really what it's all about. Okay, and anything that's not north is south. It's just any other way is no good. Okay, all right. So that's the kind of the structure. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, if I haven't lost you or bored you or okay, so we're gonna let's go back to part one now. All right, and here, as we said, this is history for the sake of history. So we're going to just take a look at Taghi Erani, kind of what was happening with him. And we'll start the story from when he's 20 years old. Okay, he died when he was 37. Okay, so he's gone to Berlin. Okay, that's 1922. All right, shortly after the war, right? And I've written this as if he is narrating his own story. Okay, so it's in the first person singular. But just so that there's no confusion, this is my interpretation of how he would narrate his life during Berlin years and post-Berlin years. Okay, this is based on sort of examining the various archives, the family archives. There's Pahlavi archives, Weimar archives, Soviet archives. His own writings, eyewitness accounts. All of these are explained in the book. Okay, so based on all of that, this is my rendering. Okay. Outside, you guys are still okay? So? Okay. Okay. So I title this one As I Saw It. Okay, so this is Taghi Erani speaking in a manner, yeah. Okay. Berlin was an exhilarating city. I had gone there to study chemistry. It was after the war, 4 years exactly. When I arrived there, the city still bore the scars of war, although it had never seen combat action. Crippled veterans were everywhere. 2 million across Germany, 100,000 in Berlin alone. Some panhandling on sidewalks. Wedding and Neukölln were working-class ghettos. Refugees were everywhere. Slavs, East European Jews, white Russians. The whites were in despair. Civil war had ended, and the Bolsheviks had survived. The Brits no longer had the stomach to topple them, so they went for Entente. This had dire consequences in Persia. The Reds pulled out from the north and left their allies, local allies, exposed. Government forces didn't hesitate to mow them down in complicity with local warlords. This is how Reza Khan gained notoriety as someone to be reckoned with. Gone was the dream of abolition. Serfdom was there to stay. The Khans had triumphed. That's what the collapse of the insurgencies meant. In Berlin, there was a bizarre mix of frivolousness and insecurity, bohemian hangouts and political assassinations. Rathenau's had been the most rattling. He was gunned down by right-wing extremists who painted him as an accomplice to the Allies. He'd been chairman of AEG before the war, the supply chain czar during the war, foreign minister afterwards. He'd been clever enough to patch things up with the Allies and still keep Germany's options open. He struck a deal with the Russians to give them chemical warfare technology for a share of the products. That was the secret clause of the Rapallo Treaty. He did the same with the Spaniards, who offshored this in Morocco. This way, the Germans hoarded an arsenal in case of another war. They also printed money as if there was no tomorrow. Okay, thanks. So they also printed money as if there was no tomorrow. They tried to hoodwink the Allies, paying them reparations with worthless paper. But it didn't work. Prices skyrocketed, the population panicked, and the French occupied Ruhr Valley. That was the heart of the German coal industry. Then Wall Street got into the act. Loans were renegotiated, debt instruments issued. The situation stabilized. That was in 1925. By then, I had been in Berlin for 3 years. I was progressing well with my studies, had passed the first of a 3-step process towards my doctorate, learned about modern chemistry, atomic theory, electrochemistry, quantum chemistry, radiochemistry, biochemistry, and new physics, relativity, cosmology, quantum mechanics. The professors were world-renowned, though some were full of themselves. Einstein pontificated about the possibility of the finiteness of the universe. Had it not been for Dositer, the Dutch cosmologist who kept up better with hard data, he probably would have gone on longer. Radio astronomers at Mount Wilson had detected the redshifting of distant stars receding from us with incredible velocities. This meant that the cosmos is not static as Einstein had imagined. Einstein also had bizarre political views. He thought it desirable to resurrect the nationhood of ancient Israelites. Haber didn't agree. He was a fellow Jew, Einstein's friend, and the father of German chemical warfare technology. I went to school with his son, Hermann. Nor did Rathenau. Nothing draws us to Asia, is what he had said. Planck, too, fiddled with religion. In his case, Christianity. He saw it as the only salvation of modern civilization, which would devour itself if left unchecked. Science and religion are not only not contradictory, but compatible and complementary, was his pronouncement. Whatever the merit of these sayings, and many had been saying things in this vein, Mach, Eddington, Jeans, Pearson, Bergson, Poincaré, their utterings pointed to a deep malaise. The Great War had shattered the Belle Époque in Europe, and with it the Western man's psyche. So it seemed anyway. Some even sought salvation in the wisdom of the East. This gave to Orientalism a second lease on life. The first fueled by greed, colonialism, the second by guilt. I came across a fair number of them. I moonlighted at the Persian press in Charlottenburg, initially as proofreader, eventually as one of its editors. My work on medieval Persian literature and the chance encounter with Friedrich Rosen, who'd been foreign minister before Rathenau, with whom I did a project on medieval mathematics in the Islamic world, landed me a job at the Oriental Languages Institute. I taught comparative rhetoric there based on my knowledge of Persian, Arabic, and Turkish literature. This was delivered in German to make it accessible to a wider audience. I delivered that course for 8 consecutive semesters. I also developed a plan for a series in exact sciences, comprising physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, and sociology. These would be synoptic accounts capturing the key theories and concepts in these fields. I felt this is what captures best the sequence of complexification in nature. First there was physics, atoms and its parts, but no molecules. Then molecules, hence chemistry. Then organized complexes of molecules, hence biology. Then neurobiology, hence psychology. Then aggregation of human groupings through the course of history, hence sociology, shaped by man's material and mental culture. Of these 5 disciplines, I did the most work on psychology. I had been exposed to the subject as a medical student back home, but what we learned was based on medieval texts, Al-Balkhi, Razi, Avicenne. In Berlin, we had Wolfgang Kohler, who gave us a reasonable introduction to it. He had written Mentality of Apes based on his observation of chimpanzees. He was also an advocate of Gestalt, how perception is all about patterns. These were intriguing, but I found most inspiration in the work of Wilhelm Wundt, professor at the University of Leipzig, who had just passed away. He had developed a conceptual framework for individual psychology grounded in physiology, and cultural psychology grounded in anthropology. My work on psychology came out a year before I completed my doctorate in chemistry and had to rush back home. That was in December 1928. Fritz Groba, who was in charge of Persia, Afghanistan, and British India at the German Foreign Office, received a letter from Persia's embassy in Berlin urging him to facilitate my expulsion from Germany. They had done a similar thing with another student on charges of anti-Pahlavi activism and had succeeded. The student went on to Prague, Vienna, Moscow. Actually, it was my efforts to prevent his expulsion that made me the object of their wrath. Okay. They also had suspicions about my feelings towards Pahlavi. I was the secretary of the Student Association and sought support from Rudolf Breitscheid to prevent this student's expulsion. Breitscheid was the leader of the Independent Social Democrats in the Reichstag. I made this contact through Willy Munzenberg. I knew Willy rather well. I had taken part in the anti-colonial conference he had organized in Brussels, in which Chiang Kai-shek, Nehru, Hatta, and many others had attended. Breitscheid wrote an incendiary article in Forwards, which had a circulation figure of 500,000. It was titled, "Love Affair with the Shah. Germany blackmailed by a despotic regime. Political harassment in exchange for trade." I must admit I didn't disagree with him, but that was more than I had asked for. So I decided to return on my own. After all, I had acted within my remit to protect the well-being of members of the society of which I was the secretary. When I returned, thank you very much. Apologies, yes. Yes. When I returned, I stayed away from things political. I got busy completing the rest of my series. I did a 2-volume textbook on physics and a set of articles to popularize concepts of modern physics. Did 1 volume on chemistry, drafted a plan for biology, but penned only a few essays on evolution. Expanded a volume on psychology. Sociology, I treated in about a dozen essays in a monthly journal I founded dedicated to scientific and philosophical themes. In this I had a column on world events echoing news from major European journals. 10 people contributed to this journal. Circulation figure was modest, 200 versus 5,000 for the National Daily. But many young people and intellectuals gravitated towards it. As I was living life in a quiet pond, major upheavals shook the world. German economic stability came to an abrupt end with the stock market crash of 1929. Without massive exports, Germany could not pay off its debts. Exports evaporated overnight. Within a few years, unemployment went up tenfold to 6 million. Right-wing parties gained ascendancy, and the Nazis came to power. They staged the Reichstag fire as a pretext to outlaw opposition groups, especially the Social Democrats and the Communists. They also passed a civil service law and started purging those of Jewish origin from government jobs. Liza Meitner, whose lab was at Dahlem, where our lab was located, lost her position as lecturer at the University of Berlin. She carried on, though, as head of atomic research at the Physics Institute, as she was Austrian, not German. Wiebert von Blücher showed up in Tehran as the new ambassador. He'd been trained as an Orientalist and knew of me through Rosen. But he went to bed with the Nazis. His wife sent me an invitation for the premiere of Deutschland erwacht at Mayak Theater. This was a Nazi propaganda movie. Okay, it meant Germany awakens. That is, it awakens under the Third Reich. Anyhow, things started going haywire in Germany. I decided to check things out for myself and made a trip to Berlin in autumn 1934. On this trip, I brought back the manuscript I had left behind in Berlin, my Rosen project, Khayyam's Critique of Euclid. I went back a second time in the summer of 1935, stayed 3 months in Berlin, and made short visits to Paris and London. There was fascism in Germany and complacency elsewhere. I reported my observations in my journal. General Jahanbani had just been appointed head of Bureau of Industry, soon Ministry of Industry. And he requested that I join his team and look after the educational establishment attached to his bureau. This included the German schools. That was now dubbed the School of Industry. I hesitated, but finally decided to accept. I saw this as an opportunity to train local experts in mining, processing, power generation, to fuel industrial growth. There was a lot of exchange happening with the Germans during this time. That was one reason I was offered this position. I was also known as an industrial chemist and had done a fair bit of science publishing and teaching, including at schools attached to the Ministry of War. There were a number of German experts in our bureau. I drew up a plan to have them replaced by local experts within a space of 2 years. I became known for my discipline. The Germans didn't like this, Dr. Strunk especially. Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's economic strategist, visited Persia when I had assumed my post. I also got invitations from the Prime Minister, Mahmoud Jam, for various ceremonies at Golestan Palace, Reza Shah's birthday, the wedding of his two daughters, Shams and Ashraf. This exposure confirmed my belief that the Pahlavi method of modernization was deeply flawed. There was no strategic vision, virtually no power generation in the country, ad hoc deals that became pretext for collecting illicit commissions. Cronism was rampant. The rich paid no tax. There was only tax on consumption. Budget for health and education was barely more than the budget for court ceremonies. The countryside lived in the dark ages, serfdom and servitude. Oil revenues never entered the national budget. They were never accounted for in the national budget. Majlis rubber-stamped diktats from the court. Country was run as a kazern by a ghazaq and his supporting cast of characters, the Amir Lashkars, the generals, and highbrow bureaucrats. I had developed a following because of the publication of my journal. With some I had discussions on philosophical themes. With a few I discussed political themes and the formation of an opposition to Pahlavi. This circle was infiltrated by a native agent of NKVD, the Soviet intelligence. When he was ensnared by the police, he decided to collaborate and frame me as the leader of a socialist sect. This suited the government, who did not want to implicate the Russians, as then Stalin would play hardball. It was also a nod to the British, who had been shaken by the general strike of the oil industry, in which left-wing forces had played a major role. But above all, it was a nod to Hitler. That we're not only great commercial partners, but also ideological soulmates. Our indictment came 7 months after our arrest, just as Baldur von Schirach passed through Tehran. And they decided to turn this into a show trial to psych out the public, project a larger-than-life character for the Shah, the chief of police, and his band of executioners. The only bright spot in this tragic development was that I succeeded to prove that I had not only not betrayed my followers and the many bystanders that had been dragged into this, but had defended them at incalculable risk to my own life. Okay. So, as we know, Taghi Erani, he was arrested in May 1937, and the indictment came in December of 1937. The trial was held in November of 1938. It was him and 52 others, so it was known as the Group of 53. As it turns out later, 3/4 of them were bystanders. And he died in prison due to deliberate attempts to eliminate him physically in February 1940. In 1941, so after he died, in June, Hitler attacked Russia. Okay, and from that fell out the plan to topple Reza Shah, as I will explain in the second piece. Yeah, and so he abdicated the throne. Shortly thereafter, within a few weeks, went into exile, and he died in exile a couple of years later. Yeah. All right. So the second piece, again, we're in the history for the sake of history, focusing on Reza Shah, the latter part of his reign, and specifically his relationship with the Germans, which is where the story intersects with the Irani story. So to kind of give it to you in a nutshell, the same thing, the same setup, if you like, that caused the demise and downfall of Taghi Erani actually caused the demise and downfall of Reza Shah himself. So that's the paradoxical part of it. All right, Reza Shah and the Germans. This is much shorter. Okay, so all right. Can you still hear me? Yeah, okay, okay, good. All right. All right. So he was never very lucky with the Germans. Actually, when he was forced to abdicate, the principal charge had been that he had flirted with the Germans. that he had disregarded demands by the Allies to expel the Germans from Persia. There were an estimated 1,000 Germans in Persia, and some were certainly Abwehr agents, German military intelligence. Is it true that he had flirted with the Germans? Most definitely yes. And why? Because he didn't trust the British anymore. Baldwin, MacDonald, Chamberlain all turned out to be wimps, in no mood for war or war preparedness. Of course, the Brits were broke, so maybe this had something to do with it, but that was not his problem. What would happen if the Russians were to roll into Persia? Would the British, from their base in the south, the Persian Gulf and the oil province, come to the rescue and face the enemy, save the country, save his dynasty? Most certainly not. Okay. They were going back to the ways of Sir Edward Grey. Make a deal with the Russians, split Persia. At most, a buffer zone in the center between the Russian north and the British south. And the Russians were sure to come. Reza Shah knew them better than anyone. He had slogged under them at the Ghazaq Brigade for over 30 years. Further, the Russians held a grudge against him personally. He had helped decapitate the Ghazaq Brigade of its Russian command and assumed its leadership with the backing of General Ironside and Colonel Smith, commanders of Norper Force. Of course, these were the white Russians. But even with the Reds, he had played hardball. When Bazhanov defected through Persia, instead of handing him back to the Russians, he handed him over to the Brits in India. And from there, Bazhanov went on to London and revealed what he knew about the Kremlin. Bazhanov had been Stalin's personal secretary. Stalin was infuriated by Reza Shah. And when Aghabegov defected a couple of years later and divulged the Soviet network in Persia to the Brits, they handed this information over to Reza Shah, and he went after the Reds with massive arrests and executions. So even if the Russians didn't want a piece of Persia, which they definitely did, they would come just for him. A remedy had to be sought, and the Germans were that remedy, especially after Hitler took the helm. Before Hitler, the Germans proved to be totally unreliable, totally un-German. That was Weimar. They wanted to trade with Persia, but couldn't even put out the expatriate opposition to Pahlavi brewing in Berlin. One of them even won a court case against our embassy when we tried to have him extradited for defamation against the Pahlavi monarchy. What a republic. The chancellor can't even order its courts what to do. But with the arrival of Hitler and his gang, things began to improve. Hitler was the perfect hedge. Everyone was scared of him. The Russians and the Brits gave him trade access to Persia. They each thought that this would undermine the position of the other and eat into their market share. At the end, both lost out, and the Germans grabbed half of the total trade. Ships from Hamburg to Khorramshahr became a maritime fixture. They would bring industrial products and take away raw materials and agricultural products. Trade went into high gear when Yalmar Schacht visited Persia. Schacht was Hitler's economic strategist. He was called Hitler's banker. Reza Shah, master of theatrics, played his hard-to-get routine. As soon as Schacht landed in Tehran, Reza Shah left for the Caspian. So Schacht, after visiting with Davar in Tehran, the finance minister, made his way to the Caspian for a personal audience with the king. This put the trade relationship on a firm basis. The Germans called it collective autarky. They sought to minimize trade with countries with whom they would be going into war, and bolster trade with others as a barter system with an efficient clearing mechanism. The Brits were in appeasement mode with Hitler and didn't mind. Nor did the Russians, who were pursuing their own version of appeasement, Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty. All of this seemed like a big green light to Reza Shah, so he kept going with the Germans. Reza Shah never left anything to chance. To buttress the relationship with the Germans, he went into high gear from trade and economy into political symbolism. The name of the country was changed from Persia to Iran, as it connoted the land of Aryans. It had a nice ring to it. The Germans built a central train station in Tehran and engraved highly visible interlacing swastikas on its ceiling. Certainly the Persians must have asked for this. I lost the thread of my thought, sorry. Sorry. I remember it as a child. Okay, it tells you how old I am. Okay. Certainly the Persians must have asked for this. The Germans would have never done such a thing on their own, or perhaps the Germans proposed it, but the Persians did not decline. Okay. All right. Pro-German journals operated in total immunity. Iran-e-Bastan, or ancient Iran, was backed by Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda chief. Okay. Wiebert von Blücher, the ambassador in Tehran, proudly hosted the premiere of Deutschland erwacht at Mayak Theater. As we saw, this was a Nazi propaganda movie, right? Germany Awakens. Yeah. Baldur von Schirach, the head of the Nazi youth camp, youth program, made a visit to Tehran to see the Boy Scouts organization with which he was most impressed. As he wrote to the Führer, he reported directly to the Führer, to Hitler. Reza Shah pushed the symbolism even further. Just as in Germany, in Persia too, it was forbidden to uphold left-wing ideologies. An anti-socialist law had come into effect in Persia before the Nazis took the helm in Germany, but this law was used profusely after the Nazis came to power. All this was, of course, against the Constitution, but since when did that matter? Trade union and left-wing activists were picked up right and left, and some were even put up for show trials, just as the Germans had done with the trial of the Reichstag fire. In fact, Stalin, who turned show trials into a fine art, had picked up the idea from Hitler. Hitler was the innovator. Everything pointed to the fact that the Persians were not only good trading partners for the Germans, but also their good Aryan brethren. The millennium anniversary of the national poet Ferdowsi was used to hammer this point home. The Persians were a pure race, pure Aryans, and only adulterated by the arrival of the Arabs. The Arabs were our Semites. Despite all this, the German connection turned out to be a bad omen for Reza Shah. When war broke out in Europe and the weaklings started falling off, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Belgium, Netherlands, Poland, France, the Brits had a change of heart. All of a sudden, they remembered the wisdom of their old Prime Minister, Lloyd George, who had said in no uncertain terms, Germany attacking Russia is as bad as Germany attacking England. If Russia fell, that would be the end of the British Empire. German know-how and Russian natural resources would be an unbeatable combination. And on the European horizon, that was the only thing that remained to be played out. Germany was poised to hit England to its west or Russia to its east, as everything else was cleared out. So it is that Churchill took the helm in London and kicked out the appeasers. So they were condemned in the famous book Guilty Men, which was a national bestseller at the time. And the Brits convincingly pushed back the German air attack in the Battle of Britain. But Reza Shah didn't register any of this. Of course, he knew about the change of guard in London and the dogfight with the Germans, but he thought that he could continue to play his double game. The South was farmed out to the Brits, so if they came out on top, he would be on good terms with them. And if the Germans came out on top, he was covering that base too, so he thought. All this turned out to be a pipe dream. When Hitler hit Russia, he crossed the red line. He had to be taken out, as were all those who had flirted with him. Besides, Persia was the perfect corridor to throw a lifeline at the Russians, who badly needed it. We're talking about 4 million people mobilized, from the Persian Gulf, where the Brits held sway. So when Hitler hit Russia, that was the end of Reza Shah. In Churchill's lofty words, we brought him and we took him. That's how he ended up in South Africa, where he died a few years later before the end of the war. It's 1944. Yeah. Okay. Last, I'm sorry, how are we doing with time?
30 minutes.
Okay, very good. All right. So this one is also 10 minutes. So history for the sake of history is finished. I hope I didn't bore you to death. Okay. All right. Drink some water. All right. Okay. So the third piece, I wanted to be a bit lighter because history can be a bit heavy. Okay. Especially this kind of history. So this is inspired, for the Persians, this is inspired a little bit by our famous satirist, De Khuda. Or if you're fond of European thinkers and philosophers of enlightenment, okay, Denis Diderot. So Denis Diderot, which I'm sure Professor Milani knows quite a bit about, he wrote this piece called Jacques le Fataliste. Okay, so this is about the story of Jacques, who is a servant to some master. The master is quite urbane and open-minded and articulate and, quite forward-looking. And, of course, poor Jacques is just, sort of caught in his world of fatalism. Everything is predetermined, was known from times immemorial and so on. So Diderot does a beautiful job of using satire to actually articulate the reigning or the predominant, preconceived notions of his time. Anyway, I don't pretend to be in that league, but it's inspired by them. Okay, so this piece I call Taghi Erani, which for the Persians is, you see, they laugh immediately. Okay, it's a bit like Jack and John or something like that, right? But I chose those names because Taghi is a very thoughtful person. Okay, so they're two friends. Okay, they're just discussing things with each other. So Taghi is a very thoughtful person, and he's rather skeptical of sort of commonly held beliefs, or conventional wisdom. That's Taghi. Okay, and Nari is the master of conventional wisdom. In fact, he's quite articulate. He knows quite a bit. Okay. And conventional wisdom is this exceptionalist mindset that we talked about a little bit. I want to kind of tease it out more in this piece. And in this case, exceptionalism in a negativistic sense is like we're damn doomed depraved. Okay, why it is that we are where we are, and it cannot be any other way. Okay, so it's just a dialogue between Taghi and Nari. Okay, and Taghi kicks it off. Okay. So I just got back from Singapore. What wonders they've done there. From the third world to the first world is the title of Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs, the founder of modern Singapore. So Nari retorts, are you suggesting that this is applicable to us? They're tiny, a mere city-state, a few million people, just like Hong Kong was before it got handed back to China. Okay, then China is not tiny, and they've done far better than we have. Of course, when you're small, you go with the flow. When you're big, you dictate your own terms. We're neither small nor big. How about Taiwan, South Korea, Japan? They're not tiny, and they're not huge. They're mid-sized like us. And they've succeeded beyond any comparison to us. Well, they're Confucian. Have you not heard of Confucius? I learned all about it in my MBA program. Okay, and I went to one of the best schools. Okay, it's a philosophy of harmony, solidarity, collective willpower. The exact opposite of our culture of bickering and feuding. But Western Europe was not Confucian. How come they were able to make such progress? You don't understand. They invented liberalism, respect for the individual. We respect neither the individual nor can act with a unified spirit. Okay. Besides, we're in the grip of a medieval religion, and the worst strand of it, if I may add. But aren't all religions medieval, if not older, at least the major ones? And don't they all have large followings, even to the present? And that religion that you refer to did not prevent this part of the world from prospering during its golden age. Why should it have such disastrous and destructive powers now? Well, it's complicated. You wouldn't understand. Okay. But it's not only religion. Our country is also a fertile breeding ground for dictatorships. Because of our feuding culture, it pops up all the time, and though it brings order for a short while, it never lasts, and we slip back into chaos. We cannot make progress because the only formula we have found is dictatorship. And dictatorship kills individual initiative. Indeed, it kills individuals with initiative. Okay. And we go down the slippery slope time and again. Okay. But East Asian wonders were dictatorships as well, and they haven't gone under. South Korea was under military rule during its economic boom. China is a single-party system. Taiwan is in the grips of Kuomintang. Japan was militaristic. Even Singapore is a dictatorship in disguise. You can't even have a chewing gum in their subways. What rocks political system seems to me is not dictatorship per se, though it's not a good thing, we all admit, but failed economic policies that threaten and destroy the livelihood of the people, throwing them into the laps of charlatans and demagogues. No, our case is totally different. Don't forget we live in a tough neighborhood. Even if we forget the animosity with our next door neighbors, there's an abundance of oil and gas in our region. Devil's excrement, as a wise man called it. Hence an abundance of meddling of the great powers in our affairs. But East Asia was subject to similar meddling. Korea got split into North and South. The war in Vietnam went on for decades because of the Cold War. And let's not forget, coal is as abundantly used as oil or gas, and some of the richest deposits of coal are in the Far East. How come this did not prevent them from leaping forward? I just don't think we started from the same base. We're a tribal nation, a hodgepodge of different ethnic groups. Each patch of our country had its own warlords with its own militia, with its own weights and measures. It's a consequence of our geography. In Western Asia, at the crossroads of many peoples, not one nation, but hundreds of fiefdoms posing as a nation. Japan too was made of hundreds of fiefdoms before it took off. 250 to be more precise. Daimyo is what they call it. Private states, each with its own militia, measured in terms of koku, amount of rice needed to feed one person or one man for 1 year. Some states were as small as 10,000 koku, some as large as 1 million. Yeah, but Japan is not an ethnic patchwork like we are. Have you not heard of the Mongol fiasco? They all got shipwrecked in bad weather on their way to Japan. An act of God saved the Japanese from the plunder of the Mongols. We had no such luck. Sure, we have more ethnic diversity, but why should we have more destructive genes? Some of the greatest public works in our country were erected by descendants of savage invaders. Ghazan, the Builder King, was a descendant of Genghis Khan. At the end, they had to settle and cope with the local realities. They were the new elite, and they were not going back, and had to manage things. Are you saying there is nothing unique about us then? That we've had no misfortunes? That does not count for anything? You seem to be a total revisionist. No, I'm not saying that. We're unique indeed in our fortunes and misfortunes. All things are unique. No two things are identical. But all things are subject to the same laws of nature and society. No one is exempt from them. They're universal. You seem to suggest that for us, there is only gravity. Things keep going down. And for them, there's only buoyancy. Things keep going up. There's gravity everywhere as there's buoyancy everywhere. It doesn't operate selectively. The Germans have a saying which captures the essence of this quite well. Everyone cooks with water. No, I don't agree. If that's the case, our water is definitely polluted. Have you not heard of our environmental catastrophe? Okay. And theirs pure. And I think that some people don't even cook with water, but with milk and honey. Okay. You just expressed beautifully, despite yourself, if I may add, the dictum of the exceptionalists. For them, some are exceptionally blessed, others exceptionally cursed, because it's a part of their nature or essence. Indeed, exceptionalism is nothing but essentialism in disguise. And think what essentialism has led to when applied to such things as race, gender, ethnicity, religion, social class, etc. Okay, it seems that you're not really impressed by all my erudition. So what's your diagnosis, Mr. Wise Guy? I'm not a wise guy. I'm only skeptical about conventional wisdom, especially when it flies in the face of empirical evidence. Call me a skeptic if you like. But I think instead of rationalizing endlessly why we are different, us versus them, it is more intelligent to see what they have in common. I mean, those who succeeded and made great strides towards national rejuvenation and modernization. Now you're just saying generalities, blah, 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 blah. This is French, by the way. Firstly, I'm not finished. And secondly, aren't you doing the same when you say we need democracy, we need secularism, we need accountable government, we need environmental stewardship, we need this and that? Fine, these are all great and necessary. But how is that going to get us any further, concretely speaking? And don't forget, India is not only the world's largest democracy, but also a secular state. Yet look at the plight of the poor people there and the lot of the women. Is that what you fancy? Of course not. So what's your formula? Before treatment, there has to be diagnosis. At least, and my diagnosis, at least as a plausible hypothesis, that is one suggested by empirical evidence, even if causation might be somewhat obscure, sort of like Wegener's theory of continental drift, which came 50 years before the discovery of plate tectonics. Okay. Anyhow, I think what these advanced nations have in common is that they're maritime powers. They're maritime powers. Some are islands, okay, and so that's the only way for them to connect with the rest of the world. Others have access to free waters and take full advantage of it. That is, they connect their productive centers not only to their domestic markets, but also to their ports, which connects them to the rest of the world. In this way, they transact directly, okay, with the rest of the world and stay in the flow of things. And let's not forget that it's been a good 5 centuries since the high seas became the principal pathways of global trade. So if you're cut off from that, you're cut off from the rising tide of humanity. In the words of a famous German philosopher, land divides, but sea unites. That's Hegel. So it seems to me what we need to do is to reconnect with that pathway, which was indeed known to our own ancestors. Achaemenid and Sassanid were maritime powers of their time. Even Safavid were cognizant of its importance. And break our obsession with the North, a common trait of Qajar, Pahlavi, and Islamic Republic. And think hard about the development of the South. Otherwise, we'll stay landlocked, despite our geography, which has given us the greatest fortune of direct link to the free waters, even after we lost the Caucasus, which cut us off from the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. As for formula, I'd simply say for us, true north is the south. That's the only path to greater generational wealth, hence a solid basis for distribution of wealth. Otherwise, all we'll have will be the distribution of poverty and all the political and cultural handicaps that come with it. We'll be drifting more towards present-day South Asia than East Asia. Interesting idea, but it'll never work. Who wants to go to the South? It's hot, like here, okay, humid, barren, ethnically unfriendly. And the sea idea is so foreign to our culture that even our greatest poets see the sea more as a place to drown than a way to connect with the world. That's exactly my point. Unless this mindset changes radically, regimes will come and go, and things will only get worse. We'll be heading south. Okay. And it would be too easy to blame the political class. But I think the real blame lies with the intellectual class, who will have failed to articulate a realistic vision for the development of their nation, rooted in its history and the experience of other nations. A concept that can not only suggest a roadmap for its realization, but can also be used to gauge the soundness of pronouncements by contending political parties and actors. Otherwise, how can we judge them objectively? Okay, so where did you get these bizarre ideas from? An outstanding figure who appeared on the stage in the 1920s and 1930s in our country articulated the notion of existential modernization, based on his observations of German economic development, which incidentally is the source of the Japanese model, and by extension, that of Taiwan, South Korea, and China. Grounded in the acquisition of know-how in fundamental science and technology, its application to industrial development, importance of trade, maritime trade, mercantilism, refuting the dogma of exceptionalism. And there's nothing I've seen in my nomadic life across the globe that makes me doubt the validity of this conception. Thank you very much.
Reza Irani, as you explained him, as a polymath that is truly a present, a gift to the world. All the facts that you shared, I would not be able to dispute them. The only thing that I could share with you is the historian Yuval Harari. There's a statement that he has made about level 1 chaos, level 2 chaos. I have no information about neither one of the two, but I just wanted to touch on the two of them. Level 1 is a type of chaos where one would be able to do a forecast, and the forecast comes out to be true. Weather happens to fall into that. History is a level 2 chaos, which nobody is able to forecast it based upon the past events that have taken place. And then again, quoting him, Christianity came to being one of the most powerful or world-encompassing religions of all time, but for all intents and purposes, Manichaeism could have taken power, and for whatever Constantine took as the decision that he made, which was a business decision, Christianity ended up taking the West. And I'll end it with the last statement or observation, and I truly appreciate what you're sharing. The last observation is there's this animosity between Northern Europeans and Southern Europeans, as it is stated between, let's say, Sweden, Southern Italy. Within Italy, there is a total animosity between northern Italians, southern Italians. Proximity to water, which was one of the points that you observed or you pointed out, could not justify the situation. All the examples that you stated, I'll just stop at that. I could go on and take the oxygen from
No, that's very good. Okay, thank you very much. I mean, I also believe in alternative histories, that things could be this way or that way. There's some kind of quantum difference that might make it go this way or that way. But I think, in my view anyway, I think the spectrum of all possibilities is latent within the present reality. And my understanding of history is that, in fact, historians nowadays talk about the long cycle, la longue durée, that it is a little bit different than sort of the physical sciences where I come actually from. It's more like biological sciences, where there is this kind of genetic code, which is memory and culture and language. And things actually tend to change less drastically than we tend to think. They change, they drift, and they mutate. But that metamorphosis is a rather sort of a... So I leave it at that. I'm not saying that just proximity to water makes you, I live in Asia, I know better, right? It is a necessary condition, but not sufficient. And if you're landlocked, then it's really an uphill challenge. Now, Eastern Europe is landlocked as well. They have the Danube. They've done okay, not as well as the West, right? But look at Central Asia, look at Afghanistan, look at all these places, yeah? So I think this maritime concept there's a broader historical theme there, the theory of shocks and so on, which we can't get into. But anyway, thank you very much. Yeah.
Just add this marital connection. Maybe at the time when some time ago was not very well described, but nowadays we talk about communication. This way of communication via railroad, via air, via maritime, via communication via satellite, via internet, etc. These are the way to help a country to be developed. So at the time, we did not have that much of, I talk about 1920, 1900. We didn't have that much of, luxuries. Now we have zillion ways to have communication. So the way that we can use this communication to upgrade the level of understanding and knowledge of the society is the only way. Whatever you can find it.
Yeah, I think we have to be optimistic, and if there's a will, there's a way.
Yes.
And intelligent people will find that way, but perhaps by trial and error and some false starts, but it will happen. Yeah, please.
How does Taghi Erani stand? By the way, thank you very much for your talk. How does Taghi Erani stand as a link between the intellectuals prior to him during the constitutional movement and then the movement, the intellectual movement that comes after?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's continuity with his antecedents, his forerunners, if you like. He often talks about the constitutional revolution as a major development in Iranian history. And as we know, there were a number of intellectuals, that were. And often he talks about how intellectual milieu is kind of a harbinger. It's telling you when the mindsets and the discussions and the narrative shift towards, progress and openness and etc. Something is in the works. And it might manifest itself in decades or 50 years later, right? So obviously there's, I can think of, let's say, Mirza Reza Kermani, for instance. He makes special mention of people like Passian. Passian, was a military man, but also an intellectual and so on. So I think there's continuity there. Unfortunately, after him, I feel like there's a kind of a discontinuity. That somehow after the fall of Reza Shah, we had really the left and the progressive for nationalists and the left and so on. The left really gravitated towards a kind of a pro-Soviet, line. And that was just a non-starter for Irani, actually. He always was for autonomy. So I think things took a turn that was different than, had he been there, we could have had an alternative history, perhaps, yeah. But yeah, in short, yeah, please.
From childhood until recent times, I've always heard my uncles, my friends, talk about the British. It's the fault of the British. They did it to us. Or it's the plan. That's why we're backward. You must have heard that too.
Of course, yeah.
There's something about us that we don't want to take responsibility
Absolutely.
for our own
Absolutely.
fate.
Absolutely. I think we cannot deny that there has been scheming on many fronts, many levels by many powers. It would be odd if that were not the case, because they're also trying to kind of position themselves and so on. But it is really not a very productive way of kind of thinking for a nation or a culture, people to constantly say it's because of them, because of them. No, we have to think for ourselves and find a way. Others have found it. Why can't we? It's possible. Yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe young lady here.
So actually kind of branching off of, I think, like what you were saying, the gentleman in the black back about, I guess, British imperialism in Iran. I do think that there is a lot of importance of at least analyzing how Orientalism, colonialism, imperialism, militarism has impacted like third world countries, because in essence we can only decolonize, de-imperialize, and de-orientalize our state if we're able to at least search that kind of history or that facet of history as well. And I mean, the reality of the world is the power exists in the global north, the power exists in the west, and that's how trade works. I mean, when we look at modern day trade deals like NAFTA, CAFTA, TPP, these are meant to benefit the capitalist west, and that is at the demise of the global south and east. And so when we see countries in the Middle East and North Africa that have been tainted and destroyed and really held back by these facets, like we have to kind of, I think, also take that into account within, a procedural understanding.
Yeah,
I mean, what I want to say is,
sure.
I 100% do agree that, access to waterways is really important in order to communicate with more developed nations, but also, there's capitalism has so much power, and unfortunately, I don't think that's ever benefited Iranians, just because our demise has helped really the West succeed.
Yeah, I think to see it in a different way and let's say, okay, let's head south, I think it requires kind of almost like a cultural rejuvenation, and that's probably the greatest fatality of all the things you mentioned, colonialism and so on, is that we were kind of disarmed from thinking properly, and of course there are thinkers and trends that have, of course, come back, and but they were never able to gain the upper hand. So yeah, definitely, yeah. Sorry. Okay.
So I was wondering if you have looked at, say, Javad Tabatabayi's book Khaj Nizam al-Mulk, where he tries to basically find some of the root of, if you call it backwardness, I'm not shy about saying it, backwardness.
Yeah.
But essentially he goes back to the period where there was a height of like Islamic, Middle Eastern, civilization, vibrant debates and everything else, while like Europe was basically in dark ages. And basically he attributes that to Ghazali, which is a great philosopher and all of that. And basically with Ghazali's condensed and saying like everything is predestined, so that he does not want people to basically go and think, which is pretty much the basis of both sects of Islam's way of thinking, like, oh, everything is pretty much what God intended to be, which is a deviation from the original thinking, because they got to that point and then suddenly Ghazali is putting that, which everybody pretty much gotten into, and that freezing of the mind was a major force in stopping what was basically flourishing at the time.
Yeah.
What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think overall, I mean, the grip of sort of the Catholic Church on Europe was no less horrendous. Okay, the Huguenots, and in France, and you have people like Descartes who runs away, and Rousseau, he runs away, right? So even there's no scope for the free thinkers, right? Yet Western Europe was able to kind of free itself from that ideological bind. So I think, and I think these undercurrents of commerce and exchange and progress just erode that religious dark ageism from the foundation. All I'm just saying is that I think we have to hit it from the root and not from the branches. Yeah, that's in simple words. Yeah, please.
Sorry, I think we're out of
Yeah.
time.
Can we take one more? Okay, please. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to agree with my friend here, saying that the second Pahlavi certainly wanted to expand and modernize Iran. And I think one of the most important things he did was to send scholars and scholarship students abroad to get educated. And all of those who did go abroad and come back to Iran really made a huge significant improvement in modernizing Iran. And their footprints still continue to be fruitful to this day after 40 years of this tragedy of this regime. And I think that what was the response of the West, instead of, expanding on the connectivity and bringing Iran into the fold of the rest of the world, it was to completely isolate and completely, for 40 years we've been under economic sanctions and wars and completely
Sure.
isolate Iran.
Yeah.
So I think that, yes, we should not look for excuses whatsoever, but the external forces are tremendous on Iran.
Yeah. But I think at the end, all dynasties, all regimes have to, they take responsibility. I mean, they're always,
Yes,
No,
people have to.
fine, but thank you very much. Okay, thank you.